Hello and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Dr. William Conlon to the show. Dr. Conlon is the founder and president of Pintail Power and the inventor of the liquid air combined cycle and liquid salt combined cycle technologies. Since 2013, he has pioneered hybrid energy storage systems for utility scale applications to address the Casio duck curve and similar renewable integration problems around the world. Bill, how are you doing today?
Good morning, Raj. I'm very well, thanks.
Bill, thank you for being on. Bill, we were speaking briefly before we started recording about your background in Palo Alto, and I'd love to start the show with you sharing that.
Sure. We've been in Palo Alto, my wife and I, for close to 40 years now. I was a graduate student at RPI in Troy, New York. One of my lab mates, we introduced to my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. We introduced them. They got married. And at the wedding in 81, my wife started talking to the groom's mother about Apple because we had an Apple computer in our lab, and she says, "Oh well, we don't know, we don't have enough people out at Apple in Cupertino. Send us your resume." And so that's what happened. My wife sent a resume. She got an interview and a job offer, and came out here in the early 1982 to join Apple Computer in the early days. So I followed her out here and went to work for Pacific Gas and Electric Company on the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And we've stayed here in town ever since.
So, how long did she end up staying with Apple?
She was there for about 5 years and did a wide variety of things. And in those days, things moved fast. She was a writer-editor on the first day. And on the second day, she was a product manager, and kind of went from there. And she ended up landing in the service division, and got to work on Apple service around the world, and then was a strategic planning person, and finally left and formed a consulting firm.
Usually I like to kick the show off with something interesting about my guest, but that in itself is an interesting story.
I think it shows, first of all, that luck matters. Random things happen to us, and you never know who might open a door for you or create an opportunity for you. So that we've been very fortunate, and I view life that way. That I was born at an interesting time in a great country, to parents who loved me and could afford to give me a good education, and I had all of the benefits of the space age era, the Sputnik era, focus on education and science and technology. So I've been very fortunate, and my view is, well, okay, now don't screw up, number one, and try to make a contribution to pay that back.
Well, I love that view. And you mentioned interesting time. The question I like to lead with usually is sharing something interesting about you. And you mentioned something about genealogy to me when we corresponded earlier. Can you perhaps expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so one of the things I know you often asked about something that people don't know about me, and maybe a couple of people know, but I have been interested in genealogy for maybe about 20 years. My dad started with a family tree, and I really took over. And to me, genealogy is a lot about exploring your own past, and we know, right? Those of us who are lucky enough, we got to know our grandparents, and of course, our parents got to know their grandparents if they were fortunate, and our grandparents that we know got to know their grandparents. So there's this history that goes back over the generations of influence. And as we try to figure out why we are the way we are and why we react in a certain way, we really have to go back through those generations. And that's part of my interest, is understanding where I came from to see what motivates me and why. And then the same thing is that those influences from the great, great, great grandparents that that really have a personal connection to me because these people, my ancestors, knew those people. I think we need to turn that around and pay it forward. There's this American Indian idea of making a decision considering 7 generations, and I kind of view that. We to go back 7 generations, and nobody that I knew those people. But so that's kind of the thing. You can easily see that your children, your grandchildren, uh, and then beyond that, their children and grandchildren. These are all people that you can have a direct impact on. And so that's the way I view my place in the world. I don't have kids myself, but I think it's really uh, the ethical world that I operate in.
So I do find that really interesting, and maybe it's just really relevant to me right now. I do have 3 young children, and in the past year, I've sent both my parents and my in laws a set of what I'm calling questions for grandparents, if you will, so they can start documenting. Because my children are asking now. My youngest is 7, and my middle is 9, my oldest is 11. And every once in a while, they ask, what did, grandma do when she was young? What did she want to be? Where did they live? And I'm an immigrant to the country. Me personally, my family goes back. We are 4 generations removed from India. We started in India. My parents, East Africa. I was born in London, and my children are born here. So records don't necessarily exist, but fortunately, my parents are still around. My in-laws still around, and I put together this questionnaire, and they can kind of start going through and creating this document, this living document, if you will, kind of addressing some of those questions that you mentioned right now. And as far as multi-generational, I was kind of joking with my middle daughter recently. I was just watching her on the sofa, and we were talking about something, and I said, you're a combination of everyone that's come before you. My grandmother, your mom's grandmother, et cetera, et cetera. All these people that came before you, you're a product of that. And so, to me, that's really, really relevant. And perhaps as I get older, it becomes more important to me. And the fact that my family's moved so much, and we don't have that genealogy, that history, that document is going to provide some of that for my children.
Well, Raj, I think you are a classic American in that sense because certainly that was my experience, my family's experience of a lot of motion from various parts of the world to come together. Uh, I'll say this: one thing we did that was that I cherish a lot is we had a videotape made, an interview of my dad and my mom on their 50th wedding anniversary, and it's a great thing to have. But your kids, all have these phones now that have video capability, and they could be interviewers as well. And I think that would be a great thing that would help to refresh their memories as well as they grow older. Remember their grandparents.
Well, another interesting point, since I started the podcast, my oldest daughter has become very interested in recording and podcast. And so now I have this mobile podcasting kit. And I said, we can start interviewing you can start interviewing your grandparents and asking these questions and, capture it live. So my parents and my in-laws are still a little bit, hesitant about being on camera. But I think doing the audio version will put them more at ease. But absolutely, I agree with you 100%. Trying to not only document but capture those recordings too. So, Bill, switching gears a little bit, can you share what your current endeavor is?
Yeah, so I have founded a company called Pintail Power, and our focus is long duration, large scale energy storage. Uh, the company is named after the famous CAISO duck. So the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, is the grid operator here in California. And in 2012 or so, they identified that the emergence of solar PV at large scale to meet the state's, at the time, 20% and then 30% renewable portfolio standard was going to change the net load curve that the transmission operator served and cause a big depression around solar noon. So when they looked at the so the duck curve comes from the change in the shape of the load curve. A deep belly forms around solar noon, and then with increasing electrification, there's a peak, a steeper peak in the evening, and the outline of that looks like a duck. So we really named the company Pintail Power after this duck curve pintail is a kind of duck.
That's interesting. And for those that don't quite understand the duck curve, can you give more details on that?
Yeah, so what happens is the solar PV, especially in California, comes on during the day. And we have so much of it now in California that we have to curtail. There's no place to put the energy. So the electric system is a just-in-time process. There really isn't traditionally storage in the system. It's not like, say, groceries where you have refrigerators and freezers and you can store a product. In electricity, it truly is just in time. It's an instantaneous balance of supply and demand. So all of this solar energy that comes on during the day, what that means is you have to use it. And if nobody needs it, then you can't use it. So we curtailed some 4,000 megawatts of solar PV on April 21st this year. It was a Sunday in the spring. Uh, that's an example. And it's projected that we will be curtailing solar energy every day in the foreseeable future. Maybe in 5 or 6 years out, there'll be weeks where we have to curtail large amounts of solar energy. So that is a problem. That's, first of all, it became a problem for the traditional power generators that have baseload stations, and of course that has helped to drive coal out of the market. It's also caused economic problems for operators of gas-fired power plants. They now need to shut them down during the day and start them up. That increases their maintenance costs. But more importantly, it means that they don't produce as much energy as was projected when they financed those plants. And so those plants have become impaired assets. They're not worth as much as people expected them to be. Well, with curtailment of solar power, of course, if you're ready to produce it, but you can't sell it to anybody, then how much is the plant worth? So we're seeing now curtailment or impairment of curtailed renewable assets, just like we saw asset impairment of conventional assets like gas-fired generation. So this is really where energy storage can come in, and the scope and scale of the need for storage is very large. I mentioned 4,000 megawatts curtailed just this year. We expect a need for some 10 to 13,000 megawatts of energy storage capacity in California on the grid. And that's storage that needs to be available for perhaps overnight, to take that solar energy and use it in place of gas overnight. So that is a very large-scale problem, and that's what I decided to focus my attention on.
So, first of all, I love your analogy about the freezer and the store. It makes it so simple for someone to understand. Secondly, can you expand more on what your product actually is?
Yeah, I come out of conventional power. I worked in nuclear power. I then moved to conventional gas-fired generation. We actually innovated there to greatly improve the efficiency of gas generation. Then I moved to solar energy. All of these things were done at large scale. And, and the history of the power business is one of economy of scale. We build it bigger because the unit cost of production goes down. Now, economy of scale works like this. If I double the diameter of a pipe through which steam or water flows, we can flow 4 times as much of that material through that pipe. But the pipe's material and cost only went up by about a factor of 2. That's why we build power plants bigger. That's why, in fact, economy of scale applies as well to things like data centers. All of this stuff is up in the cloud now. So economy of scale has driven the power business for, 100 and some years. And it's also the business I come out of, large-scale power. So that was my focus. I felt that to solve a big problem, we were going to need economy of scale to drive the cost down, because that's really what the problem is with energy storage and why we don't have energy storage on the grid. It really has been too expensive.
So, what form of storage are you working on?
So we use thermal energy. So thermal energy has long been acknowledged to be the cheapest form of storage media. Uh, and it's simple and robust. And so you can store thermal energy lots of different ways. You can store it in molten salt, as is done in a concentrated solar power plant, and that's what we use. But there are other means. There's a Siemens Gamesa project that uses rocks and heats rocks up and moves air through a rock pile to do heat transfer. There are companies, including my own, that have also looked at using cryogenic liquids where we store air and refrigerate it down until it becomes cryogenic, so cold that it liquefies. And you can store air and then subsequently regasify the air. But we use molten salt as our product, and we use it in concert with conventional generation. And our purpose here is to apply a couple of principles. One, economy of scale. This is equipment that's proven, is available at large scale to do this job. And we are looking for synergy. What we are doing here is combining the thermal energy storage, which is cheap, with a heat source from a conventional system to improve the efficiency of extraction. Because that's fundamentally the problem with thermal and mechanical storage, is its round-trip efficiency is relatively low compared to, say, batteries. Batteries cost a lot for the battery, but they have high efficiency. Thermal and mechanical systems, they can be much cheaper, but they have low efficiency. So what we do is we bring these things together in a novel way to get the cost advantage of thermal storage and the safety of thermal storage with the efficiency that you get from using high temperatures available from conventional thermal equipment. So ours is a hybrid. It's got storage and it's got generation, and they're brought together in technical and economic synergies.
So, from a footprint standpoint, how large is your facility?
We're currently targeting plants in the 100 megawatt range with, say, 24 hours of storage. And those plants would occupy a few acres. It's far more compact storage than you would have with batteries per se, or even with pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is probably the most common form of energy storage in the business. And in pumped hydro, we have two lakes or reservoirs at different elevations. And to store energy, we put electricity into a pump. We pump the water uphill, and we can hold it there in the upper reservoir. When we need the energy, it runs down to the lower reservoir through a turbine. So that's most of the stored energy in the world is in pumped hydro form. But you need two lakes, and those tend to be pretty large. We have very high energy density, so we can store a gigawatt hour, so 1,000 megawatt hours or 1,000,000 kilowatt hours in a single tank, maybe 100-foot diameter.
That's really interesting. Now, how long have you been working on this?
I came out of the solar thermal industry in the end of 2012, and I did some due diligence on energy storage. I had become aware of the duck curve and thought that this was the future, and a place where I could make a contribution with my skills and experience, and a place where I could have an impact in my remaining professional career in something that could have an impact on carbon. So I looked around. I did the diligence for VCs and governments, looking at different energy storage technologies, battery chemistries, compressed air energy storage systems, and the like. And I concluded that the problem with them was not that they wouldn't work. It was that they were not going to be low cost enough. And I looked at hybrids, like the Prius hybrid that came out around that time, and thought this really makes a lot of sense to combine. We can get these technical and economic synergies with hybrids. So in 2014, early 2014, I started developing technology and founded a company to commercialize that technology. So I've been at this for 6 years. In those 6 years, we've developed two classes of technology. One uses a cryogenic liquid air as a storage medium, and that's a technology that's suitable for very large scale, many gigawatt hours of energy stored for many weeks. So it could address the very large scale areas, and it's all based on proven equipment, similar to what is used in the liquefied natural gas business.
So you mentioned 6 years. One of the things I really like to explore on this show is the why behind the choices, why you've decided to commit to this. There's obviously opportunity cost. You saw something changed with you, let's say 2012, 2014. So what's your why for doing this?
Well, my why is to make an impact. Number one. So I became aware of the greenhouse gas problem in 1973. I had a lecture in my Elements in Nuclear Engineering class. Professor Fred White came in. He was a guest lecturer, and he told us about the the way that this planet had sequestered carbon over the course of hundreds of millions of years and taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into things like coal and oil and gas and carbonates that the shells of mollusks are made of, and various other things. So carbon got taken out of the atmosphere and deposited geologically, and that this took geologic time to do this. At the same time, we knew in nuclear engineering we were in a battle against coal, and so he says to us, "Well, look, we are burning. We have so much electricity that we consume each year, and if we do it with coal, and we have a growth rate to meet population and so forth, how long before we take all this carbon that's in coal and we put it back into the atmosphere?" And so that was a problem for engineers. We got our slide rules out, and my recollection is that it was about 10,000 years to put all of that carbon that had taken hundreds of millions of years to put in the ground and put it back in the atmosphere. That stuck with me. That is really the fundamental problem, and why I stayed as a nuclear engineer and got my PhD in that field. And throughout my career since then, I've been focused on putting less carbon in, right? We're not building nuclear power plants in this country anymore. So what can we do to put less carbon in? So uh, I felt I was a experienced executive. I'd worked on projects around the world. I'd led engineering teams. I'd done new product technology, commercialized two technologies in the energy business. I felt that this was something that I could do, and that it was also something that I should do. Now, quite frankly, I never thought it would be as difficult or take as long to get the kind of recognition that we need and to actually get a plant in the ground. But that, unfortunately, is the way it goes in this business.
I was telling someone this morning that during these interviews and conversations, a couple of common themes that I come across, individuals like yourself, is that, first of all, optimism is that you're doing it because you think obviously there's a chance of succeeding, but not to conflate that with the fact that it's going to be easy. So, absolutely understand what you're saying there.
So none of this is easy. And as we try to launch something in the energy business, it's a very conservative business. Uh, so introducing something new is a big challenge, and this is really, I think, part of the conundrum for venture capital. Uh, they are based on short-term returns, where technological innovation gives an edge, and yet the utility industry is based on assets that have lifetimes of 30 to 50 years in the field, and we continue to extend them and use them even afterwards. Transmission lines might go, as we've seen in California, for a long period of time without being replaced. So there's a fundamental mismatch here. And so to overcome that mismatch, what we need to do is use a combination of proven equipment, and that's what we do with the hybrid. What we try to do is bring proven equipment together in a novel way to achieve something better. Uh, so that is, I think that is one of my methods in trying to remove some of the hard problem here is to use cleverness and thinking and novelty with the proven equipment, and we hope that way we can achieve a comfort level with utilities and others in this very conservative industry.
I appreciate that. And you've been in the Bay Area, Palo Alto, what, 81, I think you said 1981. What kind of conversations or appetites for investment have you seen in that area since you started your project?
So I think that we saw, going back a little bit further into the mid 2000s, there was this green tech, clean tech wave where everybody was interested. Yes, and we saw a lot of companies get funded, some of them infamous like Solyndra, others that have had IPOs like Bloom Energy, but probably will not have great returns for their investors. We've seen outright losses. Bright Source is one that spent a lot of money, but I don't think they'll see a return. So there were very few profitable exits. One of the few of them was a company I joined called Osra. It was in the CSP business, and I joined it and helped turn that company around technically. And we were able to then fix the technology, sell the company to Areva, the French nuclear operator, and based on their balance sheet, we achieved over $1 billion backlog within 13 months with that technology. And that was a successful exit for the VCs. It wasn't the 10 to 1 return that they wanted. But given where we were when I came in, we actually had a 10 to 1 return on the money they let me spend. So, so that was in my view, a really successful thing. And then I left there, and the storage industry was getting a lot uh, of money. There were companies like Lightsail and Compressed Air, uh, many others that trying to develop new technologies, new chemistries. I think I came to this a little bit late to catch the wave of that. And so what I see is that VCs are often enthusiastic and embrace these things, uh, but but the ones that we saw in the green tech and clean tech era and continuing on to storage, I think what they saw is how difficult it was to be in this business, and that the business models of certainly for large systems just was not sustainable with VC money.
That is interesting. And I personally hope that some of those views change, obviously for selfish reasons and for people like you and many other people that I interview on the show and speak to, is that I see a lot of promising technologies, but I see, you know, entrepreneurs such as yourself struggling to get that early stage capital for some of these projects. And one of the things that we're trying to do here with at Nexus is to make perhaps introductions into alternative sources of investment. We've spoken to several family offices here in Dallas, and I know our CEO, Ben, he speaks to family offices quite frequently, trying to introduce them to this space because some of their mandates are changing too, where they want to invest their capital into, let's call it ESG or triple bottom line, where they can see favorable returns while making investments into projects that are good for the environment or good for the planet or even just from a legacy perspective.
I think that these are the kinds of things that dovetail very well with the problem that we have of climate change and this climate crisis. That it needs to be individuals who are committed to this. At the same time, let's take a look at the examples. There are individuals, Bill Gates among them, who have committed large amounts of money to very ambitious efforts, for example, in nuclear power. Yet, uh, this is a really expensive way to do this. And if one has to build a pilot plant to demonstrate a technology, and it costs order of $1 billion to do that, that is beyond the means of almost anybody except the government. So, to me, again, this is where the hybrid approach comes in. Look, we saw this with Bright Source. We saw it with the company I was with, Osra, that to use venture money for steel and concrete to build a pilot plant was just way too expensive. It took too long. So you have two things going against you. You need a lot of money and you need a lot of time. And those depress the returns to a point that it's not attractive to venture capital. So, so we have to cut out the amount of money, number one. And so how do we do that? Well, with a hybrid, all of the equipment is already proven, right? We don't have to develop. I don't have to develop tanks or gas turbine or pipes. All of that stuff can be purchased. So I would say to entrepreneurs, that is one of the places where you come together. That becomes more like a development business model. And then the other thing is we have to compress the time frame. We have to compress the time frame, of course, for our investors to give them a return. But we also have to do it because this crisis is an integral problem. Every ton of carbon we emit today will be warming the planet for centuries. So to get the carbon out of the air now, even with a hybrid solution that still uses a little bit of gas, in my view, is far more impactful on the climate crisis than having a perfect solution 30 years from now. So if the perfect solution arrives 30 years from now, that's great and it can replace our equipment. But our view is let's do what we can now because it's so important to reduce carbon.
So, a couple of things you said. Number one, using hybrid or existing technologies, going back to your history with Apple, in 2007, when Apple launched the iPhone, they took existing technologies and packaged them together into the iPhone. So they took a phone, they took a camera, took a recorder, GPS technology, and several others, and they packaged them together. So they essentially your model is very similar to that. The second part of what you said about good and perfect. One of the things I like to ask my guests is if you could give some advice to the audience, what would it be?
Uh, so I have a kind of innovation aphorism I would use with my engineering team at OSRA, and that is that intuition without experience and analysis is superstition. Now, I am a huge fan of intuition. Intuitive leaps are like time travel. When we have that intuitive leap in our mind and we can see this path without having to slog through all of the details, that that is a brilliant thing. So Steve Jobs, who could envision the iPhone, uh, that that was fabulous. So we need intuition, but then we need to uh, bring together uh, experience so that we know what works and what doesn't work, and we know how to bring it to market. And we need analysis to make sure that we're not fooling. Because if we just make this intuitive leap, uh, we can waste a lot of time and money, and and that brings us to the next thing that I would tell my team. I jokingly say, look, I can always get more money. I might have to sell my kneecaps to the mafia, but I can get more money if what we're doing can bring more money, bring a positive return to investors. But what I can't get is more time. And so time is really the most important thing. Our time's limited on the planet. The time value of money for our investors is critical. So, so that's why, to me, intuition is essential. So we need to prize intuition. We need to use intuition to do this kind of time travel or compressing time to get to an end fast, and and then we need to use that intuition effectively.
So, if I were to tease out the advice, I would say intuition, then use analysis, then get to work.
Absolutely. And then the challenge for all of us is how long do you go at this? I'm fortunate. Uh, I have some means to be able to sustain this. I have a great network of colleagues to support me, um, and I've been able to go at this for these 6 years. Uh, but one has to always consider: is this the best use of your time on the planet? My conclusion is that this is the best use of my.
Well, Bill, I think that's a beautiful place to end it. And I really appreciate all your hard work. And I look forward to seeing where your projects end up.
Well, I'd ask anybody who's interested to visit our website. We are pintailpower.com, Pintail power.com. And we've had some success. We were just at the PowerGen trade show, had a lot of interest in New Orleans in November. And there's an article in the December 2019 issue of Power Magazine on hybrids. And I hope people will take a
I
look
will
at that.
put links to your company site and to the article in the show notes.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure.